That's working. Okay. So I know last time we left off with the story. I think we left off with it, but Mel Brooks. But the other one I was thinking because you were talking about the girl that wrote him about the other five commandments. Um, what about the Jews in space at the end of history?
That was the coming attractions at the end of History of the World Part 1.
And if I recall correctly, you had mentioned after Marjorie Taylor Greene, speaking of which, talked about the fires in California were caused by Jewish lasers in space.
Right.
Did you reached out to Mel Brooks?
Oh, no, I mentioned I went back, because I was doing the deal for History of the World Part 2, I mentioned I went back and took a look at History of the World Part 1 again. And then I didn't remember that at the very end he had coming attractions and it was Jews in space. And he had Jews in space shooting lasers.
What about now? You have some good anecdotes also. I'm not sure if we recorded them or not, but about the making of Blazing Saddles. You had talked about, or you had.
No, I don't know anything about the making of.
Well, I thought you had mentioned at one point, like he said, he had told you a story about it. Like he just figured everybody was going to get fired because that movie was so over the top for its era, especially for this era.
It was, but I don't have any. At least I don't have any current recollection of any stories of that.
But what about what anecdotes, if any others, do you have about Mel Brooks? Given he's just such a legend.
Not really. Only the things that he tells about himself, but that's all. I don't have any individual stories that I can tell you other than the one, the bar mitzvah story.
The bar mitzvah?
The 12-year-old.
Oh, that was for bar mitzvah. I didn't realize that.
The bat
mitzvah.
Right.
Well, next on my list then is Etta James. Now, you represented her. Do you remember when you represented her?
Well, for a long time, I still represent her estate.
And how did you come to know Etta James?
I don't remember, but I got a call, obviously. And how she was sent to me, I'm not 100% positive. It may have been the label that she was signing with Private Music. I think it was Ron Goldstein, may have sent her to me, but I'm not positive.
But you don't remember when, like the era that you started representing her?
Probably within 25, 30 years ago, probably somewhere there.
What, like, as far as her career, though, you had mentioned that you had observed her. I thought you said it was Etta James. Basically, wasn't making any money. People were ripping her off.
There were a lot of people ripping her off, and so when I started representing her, this already happened. The label that she was signing with Cap Records wasn't paying her royalties. Concert promoters would stiff her, and so by that time she was already in the mode of I don't go on the stage unless I get the cash in my hand. Fortunately, that by the time I got involved, Universal had already bought Cap Records, and Universal was starting to pay royalties. The deals I did with her were with a company called Private Music, which was a good label, a good small label, and they were paying her. And of course, she did a lot of concerts around, and she went on tour, did the Hollywood Bowl and things like that. She was an amazing performer.
But now Cap Records is different than Capitol Records, right?
Yeah, Cap, K-A-P-P.
Okay. Was that common back in the day?
Very common.
For artists, not just Etta James.
Not just Etta James. What do you think? What do you think Berry Gordy did at Motown? He ripped off all of his artists.
In what way? Like how did you and
can't put this, can't publish this.
well, okay, fair enough. But for the industry wide, not with respect to Berry Gordy in particular, what was going on back then with ripping the artists off, and what has changed, and how did it change?
They either didn't pay the royalties, or they paid them such low royalties, or I mean, there was a situation with, I did represent, God, what was the group? War, the group War. They were assigned to a label owned by Gold and Goldstein. And Gold and Goldstein had them under contract and paid their bills. Didn't pay them royalties, paid their bills. And so when I went to meet with Gold and Goldstein to find out why they're not receiving any royalties, they said, we'll get back to you. What they did was they called the group War and said, you call them off or we don't pay your rent and we don't pay for your car. We don't pay the car rental. So they called me up, they said, we can't go ahead.
So that was common back in the industry then. That was just, it was
Yeah.
pervasive throughout the industry.
Through particularly the certain small labels.
So how has that changed and how did it change? I mean, it's better now, and it was better in the
It's better
80s,
now
90s.
because there was a lot of other attorneys were stepping in, like myself. I wasn't the only one. And the bigger labels, the ones that were responsible labels, generally, were buying those smaller labels. Like there was a guy in Roulette Records in New York, owned by Morris Levy. You didn't go in and ask Morris Levy for your royalties because he had a gun on his table when you walked in. Okay?
Okay.
He had a company called Roulette Records. And you didn't question Morris Levy.
So, but what happened to Morris Levy?
Well, eventually he died, but he was around for a long time. There was quite a few of these. There was Morris Levy. There was the guy Cap Records. I think it was Mickey Cap out of Chicago. There was. I want to find out what she's doing. I don't get this.
Go ahead.
There was probably 5, 6 of these labels that ran basically the same way. They would sign these artists, not pay them royalties, or pay them such low royalties. Like I took a look at one contract of one of the artists that was signed to Motown. Artist was getting 1% royalty, 1% royalty. While royalties were low, I never saw a royalty that low. Royalties were low, like 5 points or something like that. And so I saw one at 1 point, and they kept advancing her money, and of course, that meant she kept getting further and further in debt because she couldn't pay her back out of 1% royalty.
So indentured servitude, in a sense.
Basically.
And so is that one area?
That thing doesn't go there.
Is that one of those areas where consolidation in the industry helped when the bigger labels were buying up the smaller ones? They were paying fairer royalties?
In a way, I mean, the answer is yes and no. Yes, when they bought those labels. No, when they bought record labels like Geffen Records or A&M Records or Island Records, because those were terrific individual labels where the artists lost contact directly with the guy who ran the company.
But and which we talked about before, but in terms of the royalty payments, because
the royalties started going up. For instance, A&M Records had a policy of they wouldn't pay any more than 10 on 90, 10%, 10 on 90. In fact, David Berman, who was an attorney at A&M, his license plate on his Porsche was 10 on 90.
So who was paying that? The bigs?
Well, A&M was paying that way. So a number of the labels were paying. I always had 90%. A lot of them, not all, most of them were paying that. But you had the group of labels that wouldn't pay royalties anyway, and then you had the good labels like Geffen and you had A&M, but their royalties were modest. They weren't what they are today.
And well, today, I mean, they're closer to 16, 18, 20%, right? 12% low?
Or more.
Or more. So what changed? I mean, it became industry custom, or was it pressure from artists? Was it pressure from lawyers that got them to change?
A combination of all of the above.
You had talked about, well, in terms, in terms of the royalties, though. I can't remember what it was. Who back in the day, like who did you think was just really paying fair royalties to artists? What labels?
Well, it started with, leave that, Dee, please.
Oh.
That's not yours.
It's Keith.
Yes.
Jeez. Well, let me ask this instead, because you've talked a lot about how so many artists, as young artists, are breaking into the industry, and they'll take any deal that's put in front of them, and it's your job as a lawyer to protect them against that. So, but has it been that labels have really taken advantage of young artists seeing stars in their eyes, basically? And so they were offering them low rates?
The answer is it's changed over the years. I mean, they went from low rates to bumping up the rates to going to 360 deals, in which they took not only the record part of it, they took their merchandising, they took their publishing, they took their movie contracts and the television. They took a piece of their touring, but not everybody, but a lot of them. They upped the royalties, but then they started grabbing more pieces.
And you've talked about, in order to get a better deal, though, it's the lawyer's job to really know the business and know the value of the artist, right?
Correct.
And so, how do you assess? How do you do that? Like in just when you're doing a deal and you have somebody, be it Katy Perry for a first album, or an artist that comes to you, a band that comes to you, and they don't have any track record. How do you value them and then negotiate that against the label?
Call. So how does the label value sign an artist, sign two artists and treat one far better than they treat the other one? Because they believe in the success of one more than they believe in the success of the other. I mean, when I went in to renegotiate the contracts at the same time for Supertramp, this was A&M, and Captain and Tennille, I came out with even though Captain and Tennille were outselling Supertramp at that time, I came away with a better deal for Supertramp than I did for Captain and Tennille. Why? On the renegotiation. Because the label believed that Supertramp had much better long-term prospects than Captain and Tennille. They turned out to be right.
Okay. What advice do you have for young lawyers representing artists against labels and publishing companies in negotiating on behalf of the artist?
It's a simple. Know the business. Know the business that you're in. Know what the possibilities are. Understand who you're dealing against or who's on the other side, and be honest.
Going back though to where we started with this about Etta James, any stories you can tell about Etta James? I don't know anything about her other than I know her music and stuff, but I really didn't know who she was as a person or her career.
She had one of her records has become an absolute classic called oh my God!
At Last.
At Last, thank you. Thank you. It's become an absolute classic. My one great Etta James story is I got a call one day from the manager of Beyonce, and he said he wanted to do a duet. She wanted to do a duet with Etta. And I thought, wow, what a great idea. So I called Etta and I said, Etta, what a great opportunity. You'll get to a whole new audience that you don't have, and they're going to listen to you and glom onto your records and become fans of you. People that never knew who you were, but through that duet, they'll know. And she's a good singer. And I said, yeah, she's a really good singer. But, this is the quote, she can't sing no blues. And turned it down.
That is good. Now,
I didn't get a shot.
different from young artists. I mean, she was relatively speaking young, but not music industry young. Sheryl Crow. You with a lot of young artists, it's very difficult to sign them traditionally, as I understood it. People always talk about, by the age of 30, they need to be signed, and it's very difficult for, especially a female, maybe a male also, to make it or get signed after 30. But Sheryl Crow was one of those exceptions, and so she was a studio musician. I know that, but I don't know much of anything else. So how did that come about?
She was a background singer on tour with Michael Jackson, and Michael Jackson used to feature her on the tour, doing numbers. She was a background singer with the Rolling Stones. She was doing a lot of that, and then what happened was a well-known producer by the name of Hugh Padgham. He's English.
What was his name?
Hugh Padgham, English. So I really like Sheryl. I'd like to get her signed to A&M. So he talked to Jerry Moss. Jerry Moss was not that enthusiastic about it. I got a call. I was recommended by somebody who was handling her publishing, Judy Stakey. And it was very difficult to make for her because Jerry Moss was not that excited about it. He was doing Hugh Padgham a favor. So they did the album. They recorded an album. By the time they got through the album, they hated the album but loved Sheryl Crow. And then they said, Sheryl, we're going to put this away. Nobody's going to see this. Never going to see the light of day. Go do your own album, however you want to do it. And she did with a group of musicians she used to have. They were called the Tuesday Night Music Club. Because they would get together every Tuesday night and jam and play. And that album sold 15 million albums.
Wow. Well, now 15 million obviously is huge, and I'm looking at your artist roster. I don't know about Katy Perry, because, I mean, the way albums are calculated today is much different than it was back in that day. But was 15 million one of the highest you'd ever seen for any of your artists?
No, Rod Temperton, who wrote Thriller and several of the songs in that album was 35 million albums. James Horner, my composer client, who wrote the music for, what's the one with the ship?
Titanic?
Titanic. That was another around 35 million albums.
But what about for a single artist? I mean, because those are the writers.
Yeah, for a single artist, well, Michael Jackson, of course, was the artist on Thriller.
Sure, but you didn't represent Michael Jackson,
No,
did you?
I represented Rod.
What can you talk about or say about Sheryl Crow in terms of her career and her as an artist or person?
She's had a fabulous career. She's had a lot of success. She's an artist that has great respect in the artist community, and she's still out there doing her thing. She's going to be doing a Willie Nelson tribute concert coming up, I believe. And she does these various tribute things and all that. She's well respected. The guitar player from England, I can't remember his name, always asked that she do a show with him. Eric Clapton is always asking for Sheryl to do shows with her.
Just, we talked about Katy Perry, but just tell a little bit about, because this is interesting just from copyright perspective in the Dark Horse case, where she was sued. Yeah, obviously, it happened right around the same time as the Pharrell Marvin Gaye case. But in the case of Katy Perry, what happened in that case? And that you guys lost at trial, but won on appeal. What was that decision about, and how did that happen? And was it good? Was it bad?
Our defense was that the elements that they're claiming that were in ours, that was in theirs, were they call them scenes affair, or there were common elements to many, many songs. In fact, the same pattern that they claimed that we stole, that Cheryl stole, was written by Dr. Luke, her producer, previously to the other song. Okay? So he used that same pattern before they used the pattern.
So why, given that's the case, what happened at trial that it took an appeal to get to that decision?
Jury goes.
So how did the jury see it?
There was these young kids, these Christian artists from down south. Okay, I guess the jury liked them. And here is Sheryl Crow.
No, not Sheryl Crow. Katy Perry.
I'm Katy Perry, the wealthy celebrity. You know, that's what it was about. And of course, the appellate court saw right through it. In fact, the judge at trial saw right through it.
What did the judge say?
Well, he reversed the jury decision, and that's what they appealed.
Oh, they appealed that.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you guys lost the trial.
Huh?
Well, the jury verdict was in their favor. He reversed it, then it was appealed?
Yeah.
Got it, okay. Speaking of Rod Temperton, how did you know Rod Temperton, and what can you talk about as far as his career was concerned? I mean, Thriller, obviously, was...
You know, so I have to think about the appeal, who appealed what on that thing. But I'm pretty sure that's what happened, but I need to be checked on.
Well, check it after we...
as to whether
go over this
whether
again.
we did the initial appeal or they did the initial appeal. I think they did the initial appeal.
All right. So Rod Temperton is not a household name like Michael Jackson or Lionel Richie or Katy Perry. What can you talk about as far as his career was concerned and how you represented him and your representation of him?
Rod Temperton was
I thought he was great.
was a member of a group called Heatwave.
Oh, I remember Heatwave.
And I got a call. The leader was Johnny Wilder. The keyboard player and songwriter was Rod Temperton. I got a call to represent Heatwave. They were signed to an English label that was then acquired by, I believe, Columbia Records. And I got a call to see if I could renegotiate the agreement because it was a very low-end deal. So that's where I met Rod. In fact, we were staying at a hotel in Paris called L'Hotel L'Hotel, and Rod and the leader of the
Was I
group.
on that one?
You were with me, didn't
Yeah.
you? Johnny Wilder. Johnny Wilder was the leader of the group. Johnny Wilder and Rod came to meet me, and we went down to the like down the basement. I don't know what they call it. The
Cellar?
sous-sol,
Oh.
the floor underneath the ground below the street level. And I sat there with them and talked this whole thing through. They engaged me to go ahead. And so next thing I did was to renegotiate the Heatwave contract. And they were very successful, and then
That was a fun time.
horrible thing happened to Johnny Wilder. He was struck by somebody who came through a stop sign.
Oh.
He was in his car and was paralyzed.
Mm.
And he was the out there leader and dancer and everything at Heatwave. And so Heatwave that was kind of the end of Heatwave. And Rod had signed with Ron Dorn, which is owned by A&M in London, and he asked me to represent him. And his contract was coming up, and I went into A&M, talked to Chuck Kay, who was the then head of the publishing company at A&M, and he wanted to re-sign, he wanted to extend the contract with Rod, and I said, okay, we'll consider extending, but I want the ownership of the copyrights back, and any future re-signing, he'll administer it only, but Rod will own the songs. And they agreed. And so Rod owns all of his songs to this day.
Now, how did like the making as far as Thriller comes about and that historic album?
Well, Thriller, I'll tell you how it was. Quincy Jones heard Heatwave. And he said, I'm doing an album with Michael Jackson, and I want to know who this guy is who's written these songs. And so he then talks to Rod, and he says, come over here, we're going to do an album with Michael Jackson. Rod comes over and walks into the studio where Quincy is. Quincy takes one look at him and he says, "You're white."
You're what?
White.
You're white. Okay.
He thought anybody who's written these songs, they got to be black. So the first song that Rod Temperton wrote for Michael Jackson was "Off the Wall," and then "Rock with You," and then he got called back and wrote "Thriller," and he wrote "Always and Forever." It's just one hit after another.
What you were obviously in the thick of it. Thriller, was to this day I think still one of the most expensive videos in the history of music videos.
Right.
Even after all these years and adjusting for inflation, I remember it was directed by John Landis, and that was speaking directly to the the MTV era. And I know a couple things. One, MTV actually refused to put Michael Jackson on the air initially until they finally relented. But we were here. Ricky Rackman and I were actually here when MTV came on. You had the Z Channel, I think it was called. And we were very excited watching it. And we saw Motley Crue. I think was one of the first videos that we ever saw. But we were definitely huge fans of MTV when MTV was actually music television.
Right.
How did you, in your opinion, or what you observed, how did MTV change music or revolutionize music? Because I think bands like Duran Duran might not have had the same success in the 70s that they did in the 80s because of MTV.
That's because they had a featured performer on their video.
What do you mean?
Doris Cooper.
That was in the 90s, actually. That was Ordinary World, or Come Undone. Doris was on the song Come Undone. But that song came out in, I think, 92 or thereabouts. But MTV around 1980, 81 changed music, changed